ready to go?
Yeah, sure.
So please, let's start with this. I watched another video in the mornings. There's sort of this epiphany in the London train that I should go to study Mexico. I should go to study shamanism in Mexico. Let's jump in from there and let's see where the conversation takes us.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I finished my psychology degree. This is a long time ago, obviously, well, relatively. And I was kind of very disappointed with Western academy and its approach to consciousness through the study of psychology. 3 years in a psychology degree, I'd learned nothing about psychedelic experiences and all the wonderful phenomena involved there, other than it's just hallucination, right? And I'd been asked to teach, but I was somewhat disillusioned with psychology, academic psychology, the academy in general, and its treatment of the other, all these kinds of stuff. And then I just had this epiphany on the train. It was like a kind of flash of lightning, that I had to go to Mexico and study shamanism.
The year was then, what year was it then?
98, I think. Yeah, 98.
98, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That was a while ago now. That's, it's all relative. And so off I went, of course, and spent the next kind of 18 months traveling around Central America. But in that time also, I had a calling in a peyote ritual, doing peyote in the desert, that I had to come back and do a PhD and put back into the academy what I saw was missing, and that was an approach to the other and to psychedelics, which wasn't in the Western academy. And so I've been on that kind of quest ever since in many ways.
Right. So then, did I understand it correctly that there was another epiphany in the peyote ceremony that I have to go back and do the degree, right? Okay.
Yeah. So having it sent, my first epiphany, sending me out to Mexico to study shamanism, studying shamanism gave me the epiphany. I had to go back and do a PhD as well, and put it back into the academy. So it was a kind of two-way,
right?
Yeah, which I'd never really did it like that.
And the first time I understand was in Mexico, not in Amazonia. Or did you also travel to South America?
Later. My plan was to go to Mexico and work my way down, but then I just kind of went round and round and round in Mexico, because it's extremely rich culturally. There's nearly 70 different language groups. There's an amazing book called Plants of the Gods, which was Albert Hoffman and Christina H. and Schultes put this book, and it was like a ethnobotanical study of psychedelics and where in the world these psychedelic plants and occasionally fungi are used ethnobotanically, and half of them were in Mexico. So half of the world's ethnobotanical psychedelics are in Mexico, and so I kind of use that as my travel guide, basically, and just spent a long time in Mexico, just scratching the surface of that, really.
Right. Well, looking back at your 3-year study of the psychology, you said that you were extremely disappointed with that, and so what made you what was the major source of disappointment, and also what was perhaps the useful contribution, or that you feel that was worthwhile?
Well, I guess it gave me a scientific perspective, to study the nature of behavior and personality and consciousness, and understand the basic psychology of ordinary states of consciousness. But it didn't give me very much, if anything, about altered states of consciousness and what happens when we are not in those states, other than it's delusion if you're having a psychotic episode, or hallucination if you are dreaming or under the influence of drugs or something like that. And it just occurred to me that these were just kind of no-go areas in many ways, and that they just applied this whole wastebasket approach to altered states by just labeling everything hallucination, and therefore it isn't valuable or valid. It's just delusion.
Pretty much like legitimizing one kinds of experience and delegitimizing the other kinds of whole group of experiences. I think that's the
very much so. And in later years, I came across the work of Charles Laughlin, neurophenomenologist, anthropologist, who came up with this concept of monophasic and polyphasic cultures. And polyphasic cultures, like lots of indigenous cultures we see around the world, value multiple states of consciousness. A dream is just as valuable and important in their cultural worldview as is the waking state of consciousness, if not more so in many respects. Whereas in the Western developed world, we only have this kind of monophasic culture. We only really value the ordinary waking state of consciousness. Right. Yeah. With special dispensation to take caffeine to make you a bit more
productive,
and some beers at the weekend to relax. But that's not to be taken seriously. So this distinction is quite useful. I think we've denigrated the altered state.
Michael Horner makes a similar point that the Western culture is cognicentric and disregards all the other. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Groff called it pragmacentrism.
Yeah, pragmacentrism. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
So, and how may so you had studied 3 years of Western psychology, and then you took up another psychology. We can also regard shamanism another approach to psychology. Can we not?
Yeah, although within the field of psychology, there really wasn't particularly any approaches to shamanism. It was impossible to study psychedelics at that time as well, at any level in the academy. You couldn't find a supervisor or a department. It was illegal. It was frowned upon. It was taboo. And so I took the avenue of studying parapsychology primarily. At the University of Northampton, there was a research group there as a less taboo means of exploring these realms than psychedelics, but I also then quietly also was studying psychedelics as well. So like I committed double career suicide, really, by looking at both parapsychology and psychedelics. But ultimately, the bigger picture is finding a way of reconciling shamanic indigenous worldviews with the Western canon, with science, and finding a way of bridging those two worlds, those two ontologies and epistemologies, and where they intersect. And then, fortunately, of course, then psychedelics became increasingly more popular. Suddenly it's becoming less and less of a taboo within the Western academy, now to the point where suddenly everybody wants to be a psychedelic researcher, and there's lots of funding available and all the rest of it. And so this is a really good opportunity to see how the shamanic worldview can kind of marry up with a kind of the Western scientific worldview through the use of psychedelics and altered states. Perhaps kind of toning down the parapsychological phenomena a little bit to begin with, but at least now we've got to the point in the Western Academy where the cork's out of the genie's bottle. People are starting to investigate psychedelics for their clinical and healing potential, and so we can't really anymore ignore all of the shamanic worldviews and perspectives, because we can't just kind of pretend they haven't been using them already for thousands of years and we just discovered them 50, 60, 70 years ago, 50 years of which were kind of during Prohibition. So the time is right to also explore these shamanic perspectives and worldviews for what they can offer us, not just through how we navigate altered states and psychedelic experiences, but for their larger epistemology, ontology, cosmology as well, particularly as it relates to consciousness and the natural world, to psychology and ecology in particular.
Yeah, I think the key word here is the epistemology, as I see it. And how did the experience with the shamanism alter your view or modify your epistemological views back then, or how has it affected over the longer term?
Yeah, and it's been harder to initially kind of frame that within kind of a Western academic context or milieu, but effectively it's because it's so different to Western thinking. It's a kind of magical worldview, which is automatically assumed to be delusional by the Western Academy, right? So it's hard to bring it into the discourse, and it is a magical worldview in many respects. They believe in everything is interconnected, that we can communicate with what we call spirits in the West, but they have their own names for them, and they're not necessarily relate directly to what we think of as spirits. But there are these kind of elementals or forces or beings of nature which you can communicate with and negotiate with to enact changes in the material realm, if you like. And so that's the first kind of radical approach. That doesn't fit very well with Western science at all. But then there are probably easier ways of kind of aligning that. Recently, through the work of people like Eduardo Vivero de Castro, who talked about this idea of perspectivism, which is something we see emerging in psychedelic experiences in Westerners automatically, not always, but often, but is the kind of bedrock of Amerindian cosmology and epistemology, and so that epistemology of perspectivism, as de Castro calls it, is that if you want to know and understand something, or how you go about obtaining knowledge, is often by becoming that thing.
Right.
So it's a type of extreme subjectivism, where you go belong to yourself and try to merge or become the thing you want to understand. For instance, the work with kind of doctor trees in the Amazon, where you'll kind of sit and meditate with a particular tree for a period of time, taking small amounts of ayahuasca or large amounts of ayahuasca even with a piece of the bark of the tree, and you commune or become like the tree, and thereby come to understand its personality, its nature, its healing possibilities, what its medicinal values are, etc., and through a kind of direct communication, which in many ways is a complete opposite of Western epistemology. It's
Precisely,
we try and be as far removed as possible. We try to distance ourselves, desiccate it, dry it out, chop it up, measure it, try not to get involved, the real taboo of not being objective in science, which is also a bit of a myth, right? Because you can't have true objectivism anyway. All you can have is a kind of collective subjectivity, a kind of consensus agreement, which comes about through the cosmology of science, that we learn all the basic canons of science and methodology and physics and biology, but we're not experts in any one domain. But there's a kind of common language. We're not experts in every domain. It was a common language where we assume these are basic principles and givens from other disciplines, and thereby we pretend that we are, not in any way related to the things we are studying, and therefore we are objective because we have an agreement amongst other scientists in our field about our observations through replication, etc. Or even then, not everyone agrees, of course. But the assumption is that there is no bias involved, right? But of course, science is full of biases, not least the major bias of what it is we can actually study and the kinds of questions we can ask. So, neuroscientists trying to understand psychedelic experiences, say, for instance, you're having an entity encounters on DMT, they'll go, oh, great, well, we can try and show that this part of the brain is active when you're having an encounter with an entity. They wouldn't attempt to try and establish whether or not that entity is real or not. That would be that's a massive taboo. You're not allowed to ask those kinds of questions. You just have to assume it's not real, or at best a production of the brain, or maybe just don't ask that question. But let's see what's happening in the brain when you're having that experience. So it limits the kinds of questions you can even ask. So of course, science is full of biases, particularly in terms of what is taboo and what is not taboo, let alone consensus agreement, intersubjectivity, all of our own a priori beliefs, which that's a whole other package which comes along with science of the things we're allowed to believe, because we're not allowed to believe that spirits exist, or you can transcend time and space and obtain information from a different location or a different time in the future, say. So you already have to throw all of that stuff out the window, which basically throws out all of shamanism, right? And you can only continue to find support for your materialist assumptions, right?
Precisely,
You're not allowed to explore any other possible alternatives. So there is no objectivity anyway, right? There's a kind of collective subjectivity, but nevertheless, science attempts to be objective, whereas Amerindian cosmology does the opposite, and it says, right, we're going to be hyper subjective. And again, that has its own myths as well, in that how do we know, you are really communicating with the tree or understanding its nature or its medicinal properties, other than by application, of course. But it's inherently suffused with its own biases that we have to kind of believe that to make it real, for it to be useful epistemology, and it could just be projection or anthropomorphism. So both of them are problematic, because we can never fully apprehend the truth of the reality of the external world. But they are both useful epistemologies, right? And they are practically applied. Science is obviously very practical in terms of what we've come out with, technology and all the rest of it. But Amerindian epistemology is also practical in that, they've found ways of more successful hunting, or, perhaps finding lost objects, or understanding the medicinal properties of various plants, right? Which must have worked to some extent for all these indigenous peoples and hunter-gatherers to have survived for this particular way of life for thousands and thousands of years. So, but it's a different one. I'll give you a good example. So 2 weeks ago or so, there was a plane came down in the Amazon in Colombia. Did you see this? There was
I heard, but please carry on. I saw the title. I didn't look into that.
There were 7 adults on board. There were seven people on board, 3 adults. The 3 adults died immediately in the crash, and there were 4 children left behind, aged between 1 and 13 years old. And they survived in the jungle alone for 40 days and nights. It's kind of almost biblical, it's like a kind of Walt Disney fairy story. And they were led off by a duende, which is a kind of like forest spirit, a duende, like an elf or a pixie or goblin, gnome, something like that. A forest spirit led them off to a place, and they stayed in this clearing. And they were able to survive for 40 days and nights because they were indigenous, right? They said that even though they were only children, they knew how to survive in the jungle. The army sent in 150 army recruits to go and find them. And they were only 3 miles from the crash site, so they weren't very far. But they spent 40 days and nights looking for them, couldn't find them, and then eventually on the 39th day, an indigenous ayahuasquero who was with the army drank ayahuasca, and they were able to then to find them. So in this case, for all the technology of the military, it didn't help them in this particular environment. It required a kind of Amazonian approach to finding them.
Are they epistemology?
Amazonian epistemology. That is, if you want to know something, you drink ayahuasca and you kind of transcend time and space and find out the location of them, or whatever it is you have to do. In this case, it was also like working with the duende that had led them away, right? Supposedly, the kids said they'd follow this duende. So it's a whole different cosmology, which, and it's what is most astonishing about this story is not that this happened, because this happens all the time with indigenous people. But the astonishing thing is this got published in the mainstream media.
Right.
That's the only astonishing thing here.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Go on.
You said that you have been almost 25 years in this science. When did you notice by yourself that there is change in Western science?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it has been happening gradually, I think. Certainly in the kind of field of psychedelic research, I think that's really stimulated a lot of interrogation of these phenomena more so. For instance, in a lot of these clinical trials where they're using psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to treat depression, anxiety, end-of-life existential fear, addictions, some of the researchers have chosen to explore, the nature of the psychedelic experience itself, and they've devised measures, and they measure the mystical experience. So, how intense was your mystical experience? And it turns out that's a very good predictor for clinical outcomes, not more so than dose itself, right? It's like, it's not just how much you dosed, it's like, did you have a mystical experience? And the more you score on the mystical experience, the more mystical your experience is, it always directly correlates with clinical outcomes and reductions of symptoms. Reliably, every study is been looked at pretty much. In some cases, very strong predictions of clinical outcomes. And so we have, in the last 15 years, the concept of the mystical experience, which up until this point was either demonized or pathologized, the West, has now done a kind of complete 180 and is now seen to be potentially part of the cure. Like, it's no longer considered necessarily to be guaranteed kind of madness or delusion. It is now actually, this may lead the way towards some kind of sanity. So we're starting to see this kind of shift, which is, subtle, but it's having increasingly wide-reaching effect. You couldn't talk about this stuff in science until the last 10 or 15 years, really, until a major medical hospital in the States, Johns Hopkins University Hospital, one of the most prestigious medical universities in the States, started doing this research looking at mystical experiences with psychedelics by a kind of a very well-respected professor who had spent his whole career getting National Institute of Drug Abuse grants and doing research on addictions and stuff like that. He suddenly goes, right, let's do a replication of Pankay's Good Friday experiment, demonstrating that psychedelics reliably induce mystical experiences in about 2/3 of participants. That kind of, like, there was a big shift, and since then, the cork is out of the genie's bottle. You can't honestly explore psychedelic experiences without engaging with mystical experiences and all the other stuff, which we haven't got to all the other stuff yet. I'm trying to kind of prise that open a little bit. There are kind of huge increases in people having experiences of telepathy, clairvoyance, communicating with the spirit, with their deceased loved ones, all the kind of classic paranormal or transpersonal phenomena that is part of the normal daily experience of indigenous shamans, for instance. So Westerners suddenly having psychedelic experiences increasingly more and more, are also increasingly having more and more of these shamanic-like experiences, which are kind of quite ordinary in the shamanic worldview, but very alien to Western minds. And I think like this experience of perspectivism is one that recurs as well. So I did a survey of psychedelic users, Westerners, and for instance, those people had taken ayahuasca. 25% of them had said they had an experience of changing into another species. That is a classic perspectivism. Like, you know, you take ayahuasca, you turn into a jaguar, you turn into a serpent. Usually you turn into a jaguar and you get surrounded by serpents. Or, you know, you turn in, you want to understand some kind of creature or tree, you turn into that thing. So that's perspectivism. And, you know, 25% of Westerners taking ayahuasca will have that experience, but that's not what it says on the tin. You know, they go off to do their ayahuasca retreats to reduce their depression or connect with their spirituality, or have better insights about their new tech app they're developing, and then they end up turning into a tree or a jaguar or something like that. It's not necessarily what it says on the tin. And in some cases, these can be useful experiences. And so we know this from our study. We did a clinical drug trial looking at creative problem solving with top-level scientists. We got 40 scientists from Cambridge, Oxford, Imperial, or with PhDs or just finishing off their PhDs in maths, engineering, physics, biology, and so on and so forth. They all had a really difficult problem they were working on. They had to bring a theoretical problem in their field, in their expertise, which they did not have a solution to, that they were working on or thinking about. They came into our lab. Most of them had never tried psychedelics, and they took LSD and thought about their problems. We haven't fully published all of that yet. Luckily, some of the participants have de-embargoed themselves by talking about their experiences. And one of them was a biologist. He'd spent 3 years at Cambridge studying the relationship between this fungus and a plant. The plant's called Burke'i. It's a ghost plant. It grows directly out of the mycorrhizal fungus, and it seemingly gets all its energy from the fungus because it doesn't photosynthesize. It has no chlorophyll, hence it's kind of, they're either white or red or, you know, translucent. They're not green, these plants. They have no chlorophyll, so it's getting its energy from the fungus. And his question is, well, you know, what is the nature of this relationship? It was always considered to be parasitic, that it's a one-way extraction of the fungus from the plant. He came to our lab, he took LSD, and we interviewed all our scientists about their experience to see if they'd had a breakthrough. And we asked him, so Merlin, how was your experience? And he says, well, I turned into the fungus. And I was like, oh wow, great, you know, that's really interesting. And how was that experience? You know, hoping it had a breakthrough. And he said, slimy. And we were like, well, that isn't very useful, but, you know, great, never mind. But then he published this book. It's called Entangled Life, amazing book about fungus. Bestseller charts for over a year. Won the Royal Society Book of the Year award, and this is the most august body of, you know, science in the UK, the Royal Society. Book of the Year award. And in the first chapter, he talks about his experience in our lab of being transformed into the fungus, and it said it changed how he thought about his problem, and he looked at it in a different way, in that he looked at it for the first time not as a human, not as a scientist kind of staring down the microscope over and over again, but as from the perspective of the fungus. And he had the experience of growing inside the rootstock of the plant. And it changed his thinking about this problem. I'm not going to tell you, you have to read the book because I don't want to ruin it for you.
Well, we interviewed actually Merlin for the third.
Okay, great. So you've had Merlin. Great, wonderful.
It's in Estonian as well.
Yeah, it's also translated into Estonian now. Yeah.
Fantastic. So that is a kind of a classic example of, you know, a psychedelic induced experience of perspectivism, which has a pragmatic value, right? And so what I would like to see in attempting to marry shamanism with science in the Western Academy is that maybe we make room for this kind of approach as well. Let's not say, okay, one is better, or this one's delusional, or this one's real, or, but that, you know, because of naive realism, we can't ever truly know what it is. You know, our best science is just models, they're maps, it's not the absolute reality. And I'm not saying nor is these experiences are being turned into a fungus, say, but if it gives you different perspective, if it gives you useful ideas, which you can then go away and test empirically using all the usual methods of objective science, so-called, then, you know, we've got to broaden our opportunity of discovery. And there are cases of discovery which have, like this, which have led to Nobel Prizes, such as, you know, Kary Mullis won the Nobel Prize in biochemistry for his discovery of PCR, polymerase chain reaction.
Could you say the name again? I'll write it down.
Kary, Kary, Mullis, M-U-L-L-I-S. Kary Mullis. He in the early 90s, I think he discovered this technique called PCR, where you can take a single strand of DNA and replicate it. And this was hugely important because PCR enables you to do genome sequencing, genome mapping, genetic testing, DNA analysis, forensic genetics. Everything in genetic research relies now on PCR. There's this, even like, you know, in the pandemic, we have these PCR tests, right? And Kary Mullis won the Nobel Prize in biochemistry for this. Then shortly afterwards, he basically said, well, I'd taken loads of LSD, and I developed this technique of being able to fly alongside the strands of the DNA molecule and see what was going on at a molecular level. And so it was his use of LSD had given him this ability to shift his perspective, to go and look at things at a molecular level, which is what Amerindian ayahuasqueros talk about. They say they can see inside bodies, they can see organs, they can see cells, they can see DNA. And it turns out so can Westerners. And in our survey, we found 10% of people who had taken LSD said they'd had the experience of being changed into another species as well. So it's not just ayahuascas, you know, it has this cosmology. Even LSD gives rise to people having these kind of perspectivist experiences, which we find in Amerindian cosmology as well. So what I'm arguing it for is that there is a possibility here of increasing the range of doing science. You know, if Kary Mullis hadn't taken LSD, he may not have discovered PCR. He said that, you know, he doesn't think he would have. So if we just stick to this kind of ordinary waking state of consciousness, objective science, that might be good for doing replications and good lab work and being good engineers, but not necessarily for being good innovators or discoverers. You know, there is a difference of what we call convergent thinking and divergent thinking. You know, psychedelics enhance convergent thinking, where you have lots of new ideas about old problems, some of which are a bit wacky, probably don't work, but some of which may be useful. Whereas our normal everyday analytical eye, going back to the Saint Bonaventure, you know, the analytical eye works by what we call convergent thinking. That is, you know, you weigh up all the facts and you come up with one solution, one best solution, which you then go away and test, and you're either right or you're wrong. Whereas with divergent thinking, you know, you're just coming up with lots and lots of different ideas, and that kind of really only works when you're in the contemplative mode, you know, in this kind of introspective, in this psychedelic or dreamlike zone, where you're having all these kind of changes in your mental imagery, turning it into different species, crashing together old memories and ideas in unique and novel ways. And so there's room here for doing better science. And I think, I'm sorry if I'm ranting, I think this is also probably best applied to our most current cultural problems, such as the ecological issues, because this really applies well. You know, shamanism is a nature-based epistemology. It's all about reciprocity, being in right relationship with nature, negotiating the needs of all the different elements and beings within the natural world. And so you are automatically in this different, you know, shamanism, indigenous epistemologies, generally speaking, do not see a separation between themselves and nature. You know, they are nature. We are nature. It's like they are not, they are a part of nature instead of a part from. And that's the Western worldview, is we see ourselves as being apart from nature. There's these measures we use in psychology. It's kind of the nature and self, and it's got these two circles, one's nature, one's self, and you ask people, how overlapping are these circles, you know? So this is total separation, a little bit of overlap, more overlap, and then one circle. Nature and self are the same. Westerners, we're kind of about here. We're kind of, generally speaking, we're kind of slightly overlapping. After people take psychedelics, they're like here. Indigenous people, it's the same. There is no separation. And in fact, Gregory Bateson talks about, and I'll come back to Nabi, his work with the Ashaninka, and he was asking them about this thing, this concept of nature, and they didn't have a word for nature. Right? And that is because nature is that which is not culture. Okay, you know, and culture is that which is not nature, that which is belonging to the kind of creation of humans. And in them, there is no difference between nature and culture. Culture is nature, nature is culture. You know, they are inseparable from ecology. They're just that, you know, we are these nature beings we communicate with. They are us. You know, they're part of our tribe. We are them. We were more like them once upon a time, but now we are in this material realm, or whatever it is, but there is no separation. So already at the base of it, you have an epistemology which has a completely different relationship to nature. And therefore, for ecological issues, I think it's really important, because we are in a massive ecological mess right now. We're in the biggest massive wave of mass extinction in millions of years, the sixth mass extinction, almost certainly all man-made, let alone climate change and habitat loss and environmental degradation, pollution, toxification of the seas, you know, like toxic floating rubbish dumps the size of Texas in the Gulf of Mexico, all of it, right? And we haven't done very well with our relationship with the natural world through our scientific technological perspective. It's only getting worse. And so, you know, the same thinking that got you into the problem cannot get you out of it. And so if you have, you know, if we also introduce this kind of perspectivism, then we can look at it from a non-human perspective. We can go, actually, it's okay to have an experience where you turn into a fungus. It may not be real. It may be real. It doesn't matter. But if it gives you a perspective of an ecological issue or a biological problem, which gives you better insights and better solutions than thinking like a human, then that is valuable, even whether it's real or not, you know. So if we leave this part of the equation out, as we have done for hundreds of years now, we're only going to continue to go down this particular self-destructive, ecocidal kind of path, I believe, you know. Thinking like humans and that we are separate from nature is not helping us. Perspectivism and thinking we are nature, and therefore we can think like a mushroom or a tree or experience their consciousness, real or not, can help us find better solutions to ecological problems, I think.
It was a key word here, what I've heard so far is perspectivism. which has come up in today's conversation a lot. I think Stanislav Grof calls it experiential identification, or so. It's pretty much the same thing, right?
Yes, great. Yeah, you can call it that. Yeah, I think that's a nicer way of putting it. In many ways, it's more palatable.
That's the point. One point is the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was a term brought around by a Brazilian anthropologist, Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, but it's the same thing. And you know, in our research with psychedelics, I haven't used Grof's terms, but you know, we talked about having experiences of transformation into another species, or even that's 25% of ayahuasca users have that, whereas communication with other species runs as high as like 75%. You know, people have an experience not necessarily of turning into the thing, but having a dialogue, and that is also part of this kind of shamanic worldview and milieu as well. So it's a common experience that, and one that we can possibly regain, I believe.
Yeah. Well, I'd like 20 minutes to go. All right. Mystical experience. I think that takes us to the. I mean, it's obviously hard to pin down or define what it is, but I think most people would agree that connectivity is there one of the key terms, and this kind of leads us naturally to the third angle in our conversation, the ecology, which has already come up. Please let our readers know what you talked about this speech of yours, where what was like the rise in ecological awareness that came out from your experiments. I think that will be the last big chunk of the interview.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. So that's one of the interesting things, and thanks for raising that. And in that, what we find quite reliably when people have psychedelic experiences, and actually also near-death experiences, that's been known for a while, but psychedelic experiences is people feel more connected to nature. They feel more connected across the whole spectrum, actually, but you know, my research is focused on connection with nature. We found, you know, this kind of overlap of these self and other kind of increases when people have psychedelic experiences, and that doesn't matter if it's in the lab or in a natural environment. Our guess is it probably works even more if you have to be having your psychedelic experience in nature, and that has potential benefits because the more connected to nature you are, the more time you spend in nature. The more time you spend in nature, the better it is for your well-being. You also take more care for nature. And we basically did a survey of people who would take psychedelic users, and we asked them to connect the question of, has taking psychedelics made you feel more or less connected to nature? And 100% of people in our survey, there's 150 psychedelic users, said that taking psychedelics had made them feel more connected to nature. That's like, you know, an absolute given, it would almost seem, if you take psychedelics for long enough. And it's something you never see in social science research. You never ask a question in a psychological survey and 100% of your sample agree, right? It's okay. So 100% of psychedelic users said taking psychedelics made them feel more connected to nature. 2/3 of them also felt more concerned for the environment. And then we also looked at not just changes in attitudes, but changes in behaviors as well. And we found that just over half of the people taking psychedelics said it had changed their diet. It made them change their diet. We don't know what they changed it to, unfortunately, presumably more ecological, like vegetarian or vegan or whatever, vegan, who knows what. Hopefully they weren't just all eating magic mushrooms every day, maybe. Just over half said they'd increased the amount of gardening they do as a result of taking
rampant gardeners.
Yeah. Everyone turns into rampant gardeners. Well, half of all psychedelic users turn into rampant gardeners. That was the one I wanted as the headline, you know, on the newspapers.
Yeah, I remember that from your speech.
And you know, even people engaging more ecological activism, donate money to ecological causes, adopt animals, and even 60% of psychedelic users change their career to something more ecologically orientated. So we're seeing these big changes in attitudes, we're seeing big changes in behaviors as well from psychedelic experiences. And what's driving that is this enhanced connectivity. We also looked into that even more, and we found that those experiences of connectivity seem to be enhanced by transpersonal experiences in particular. You know, feelings of transcendence, a feeling of like connection, deeper empathy, or even experiences of transformation, you know, what Groff called experiential identification or perspectivism, interspecies communication experiences. Nevertheless, people are having enhanced connectivity experiences. And this connectivity, in many ways, is what we see underpinning the psychedelic experience across the whole range. On the biological level, the psychological, the sociological, the ecological, the cosmological, and the theological levels. You know, if we were to summarize in a generalizing way, what we've discovered about researching psychedelics is they enhance connectivity, and they enhance it on a biological level in the brain, because we see under the influence of psychedelics, there is a massive increase in neural connectivity between parts of the brain which don't ordinarily communicate with each other. You know, there's a reduction of activity in the default mode network. There's no increases in activity anywhere, but there's a massive increase in connectivity. And suddenly all these parts of the brain, which are constrained in the kind of communication they can have, are suddenly have the shackles taken off. And, you know, all the parts of the brain are communicating with every other part of the brain simultaneously, perhaps for the first time in waking consciousness, since a child. Child's brains are more like this than adults. And we think this connectivity gives rise to experiences like synesthesia, you know, which is a blending of the sense experiences where you can see sounds, taste shapes, all the rest of it. But also it relates very closely to divergent thinking as well. So instead of having this kind of very constrained, normal, everyday, logical, linear, convergent thinking, we have a lot increased divergent thinking, where you're having new associations of old memories and things, and putting things together in very novel and unique ways, which leads to better creative problem solving. And also then on a psychological level, people feel more connected to themselves. As Groff used to say, you know, people have, it makes the unconscious material of the psyche available to the conscious brain or mind. And therefore people are connecting with, you know, childhood traumas, their fears, their desires, their phobias, things that have happened to them in their life, reliving childhood memories. And they're able to kind of process that information, find, you know, have a cathartic experience, gain insight into their maladies, their illness, their depression, and feel more connected to themselves. You know, they're more whole, they're more connected to themselves, they feel more connected to other people as well. On a sociological level, people connect more to other people. Psychedelics, generally speaking, enhance empathy, they reduce authoritarianism, they enhance openness to experience, which means you're willing to engage in other cultural practices, try different food, listen to different music, engage with different people from different cultures. They enhance pro-social behaviors. That means doing things for other people other than yourself. They enhance compassion, and so on and so forth. So they make people more connected on a sociological level. And on an ecological level, we know they also makes people feel more connected to the natural world, turn into rampant gardeners, quit their jobs, take up PhDs in botany. And then the people also feel more connected to the cosmos at large on a cosmological level through the mystical angle of the experience. People feel like they're connected to the universe itself, you know, to kind of, they transcend time and space and have a deeper connection with the cosmos. They have these transpersonal experiences. They go beyond their normal ego identity. And that also spills over into a connection on a theological level as well, where people feel more connected to something spiritual or divine. So across the whole spectrum, generally speaking, psychedelics enhance connectivity on every level. That's one way of summarizing kind of what they do.
Yeah, everything you explained right now reminds me that all those people who are more connected, they're like their eyes are more open and their ears are more opened. And who said that those people could notice signs and symbols around themselves? And we have also one practical example. I would like to hear your opinion of that. It was last spring. We've been in Amsterdam, and we saw there's this swan in very narrow channel with very nice colors. It was something really
kind of vivid picture of
Yeah.
a swan.
vivid picture, very mystical. So those swan followed us. Time to time we noticed, and today morning before interview with you, the swan was. We are in countryside right now, and our house is next to the river, and the swan was at our house.
We didn't ask for the identification, so it wasn't probably the same swan.
But there's a symbolic resonance there,
Yes,
isn't
yeah.
it?
All right.
About those
So yeah, so
symbols or
swan in shamanic
Yeah.
shamanic traditions. So do you
Yeah.
have anything to like?
Well, that's because it's more of I mean, you don't get it in the Americas, naturally speaking. So it doesn't have a.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure with kind of European shamanic cosmology around swans. I'll look into it though. But there is a truism that, yeah, taking psychedelics or having these experiences of feeling more connected makes you more aware of synchronicities of it changes your perception, that you're more readily able to associate. You have that interconnected mind where you're not just kind of doing the logical linear every day, follow this particular brain activity path repeatedly. You are kind of like open to experience. You're seeing more connections in things. You're seeing connections in things which are probably there that you don't ordinarily see because we've got our blinkers on, and we've done the first bit of research to show that actually people who take psychedelics have more synchronistic experiences. Now, we can't say whether they're real or not, but it changes people's perceptions. People also have more experiences of telepathy and clairvoyance and all of these things in the long run as well, not just during the experience, but afterwards. It changes their beliefs and experiences about this phenomena. So these substances, and not just psychedelics, but I think any altered state, altered states generally, psychedelics are just the kind of the most reliable, profound way of inducing these things quickly and easily, right? If you do the work and do the meditation or the breathing techniques or the drumming or the dancing, you'll get there as well, but it takes more work. But all of these altered states lead to the same thing, and that is kind of increased connectivity, a greater openness to these experiences, and people's beliefs shift and change as a consequence. And in some ways, in very profound ways. For instance, with some recent research, again from Johns Hopkins University, looking at people who have taken DMT, which is extremely potent 10-minute psychedelic experience, which is like having a whole ayahuasca experience in 10 minutes. People have described it a bit like being punched in the back of the head by God. And often people have encounters with beings, which the majority of people believe to be real. They say they're more real than this real when you have these experiences. And when they did a survey of people and their prior spiritual metaphysical beliefs, and they found that of those people that had DMT and had these encounter experiences, of those that were atheist before, less than half of them remained atheist afterwards, right? So you have a profound 10-minute psychedelic experience which can convert more than half of all atheists into non-atheists. These are extremely potent kind of metaphysical worldview shifting substances, ontological shifting and even epistemological shifting substances. But they are kind of like, they've been demonized and pathologized by the academy, the West, the kind of culture, our milieu, our politics for a long time. And to our detriment, I believe, as well, because, you know, we you know, continuing with this materialist perspective, both philosophically, you know, in terms of materialist reductionism, brain produces mind, and also materialism in the fact that we value material possessions and capitalism and all the rest of it, has left us spiritually and ecologically bankrupt, right? You know, we've lost our sense of meaning, we've lost our way, and we are effectively destroying our own habitat and that of all the other species on the planet. So, you know, I think that there's time to kind of open up to these other perspectives in many ways.
Well, it seems to me that the worldview basis of shamanism, call it animism, is coming back slowly into the West in the form of ecological thinking. What do you think of that?
Yes, I think you're probably right. I don't know of any research on this, but
it's just kind of intuitively, yeah.
Oh yeah. I think so. I mean, it'd be interesting to see. I think there's almost certainly data to support that idea. You don't have to be an animist to be an ecologist or be ecologically concerned, but I imagine most animists are ecologically concerned, exactly. And I imagine most ecologically concerned people are probably also animist leaning, if not total animist anyway, right? And we're seeing an increase in panpsychism as well within science and philosophy, which is great. You know, panpsychism had almost died out, but now it's at a recent survey at the Science of Consciousness conference this year, they found that panpsychism was the second most favored theory of philosophy of consciousness, of mind and consciousness. So it's certainly on the increase. And of course, panpsychism isn't too far away from animism, although there is a bit of a mismatch, right?
What was the first? Materialist?
I can't remember what the first one was. I was just, panpsychism second. Might have been. I don't even think it was materialist. I'm not sure. But maybe more kind of naturalist, emergentist philosophies. I'm not sure. But panpsychism has certainly grown in popularity recently. So I think there is a shift happening, and I think it's a kind of probably a practical one. You know, we may never understand the true nature of reality, and that may not necessarily matter too much, but you know, our beliefs guide our behaviors, and you know, the current blind, bankrupt, materialist perspective is running us into the ground, really. And I think we should perhaps open up to the possibility that indigenous people have some wisdom, you know, at least by evidence, the way they engage with the natural world, their system of reciprocity, that is, you never take without first giving, and you never take more than you need, or what you don't take unless you do need it. Hence, they don't, you know, engage in rabid extractivism and destroying the planet. You know, that has some value. They haven't brought us to the brink of ecological collapse through their epistemology, their ontology, their worldview. And in fact, you know, 90% of the world's wilderness, like the last natural habitats we have on the planet, where most of the biodiversity is, are looked after by indigenous people, you know, who represent about 10% of the population. They're the ones who are preserving the wildest places on the planet with the highest biodiversity, and potentially all of our future medicines and our kind of resources for survival and oxygen and all the health of the planet are being stewarded, the caretakers are indigenous people who don't engage in rampant destruction and extractivism. So we should probably listen to these people and hear what they have to say. And if I think there's room within science to engage in perspectivism as well, and to engage in divergent methods of problem solving without losing anything. We can still verify our insights, our creative problem-solving discoveries, our PCR and our turning into a fungus or whatever it is, through objective science, right? We don't lose anything, we only gain something. And we also give these indigenous people a place at the table and some respect in the broader conversation. Is that it?
Kaya goes to core. We need a cord here for the power supply.
Oh, no problem. I was just ranting anyway.
No. Right. Just hour is up, and I may have misheard, but you said that you'll come back to Narby. Did you?
Oh, yeah. Very good. You don't miss anything.
Well, so that's what.
Yeah, well, Norby gives us another example of perspectivism as well, in that he'd written this book, The Cosmic Serpent, and he basically put forward the idea that indigenous people could see DNA. And of course, it sounds crazy because DNA is very small. How can you possibly see it? Well, they're not seeing it with their sensory eyes. If anything, it's either the imagination or some kind of direct experience. And so we tried to test this idea. Look, about the same time, Kary Mullis won his Nobel Prize for his discovery of PCR. And then, so Narby wanted to approach this as experimentally as he could. He took 3 molecular biologists who all had a block in their research, a bit like our experiment. He took them out to the Amazon, and they all drank ayahuasca, and all 3 of them had a breakthrough in their research. 2 of them also changed their worldviews to that, suddenly incorporated this kind of broader Amerindian cosmology or perspective. And one of them said she was able to fly alongside the strands of the DNA at a molecular level and see what was going on. So she had this classic experience of perspectivism. So just to say that Narby is one of the few people to have any kind of good empirical data to bring to the table on this, as well as having some great input on talking about the nature-based epistemology of Amerindians. So yeah, just wanted to add that in. Thanks for reminding me.
And perhaps the very last question. I have the great books course here at the Estonian Business School, where we have a little corner where we can do our panpsychic stuff.
Very good.
Of all places in the business school.
Beautiful. That's poetic. I like that.
It is poetic, isn't it? And the next, we have the 11th season coming up, and it's devoted on the Aldous Huxley's Perennial Philosophy. Just a few off-the-cuff remarks on that book, on that author. Just the very last.
Yeah, I mean, Huxley and his notion of the perennial philosophy, that there is a kind of ultimate ground of being, which you can access in altered states of consciousness, and that is the same. It is the same ground of being that mystics and scholars and spiritual people or psychonauts, whoever it is, access anywhere in the world. That there is a commonality to all of the mystical traditions the world over. That is essentially the perennial philosophy. And of course, he added to that with the Doors of Perception, in a later book, talking about how you can access this kind of perennialism, by transcending time and space. And accessing this deep truth about the nature of the universe through altered states. And that is his conception of the mind and brain, was that actually the brain is not a producer of consciousness, it is more of a filter of consciousness. And so it kind of narrows down our conscious experience for us, so we don't get overwhelmed by experiencing the ground of being when we're trying to go to work or get on a bus or tie our shoelaces, of course, and he said, so it acts like a reducing valve. So it just drips feed as a small segment of reality or consciousness, so we don't get overwhelmed. And he says, but under the influence of psychedelics like mescaline, which he'd just tried from Humphrey Osmond, he said the psychedelics act to turn off the reducing valve of the brain, this filter, and give you access to mind at large, as he called it, the perennial philosophy. And in many ways, it took 60 years for anybody to really kind of revisit that idea, for at least for neuroscience to catch up. Maybe even longer, actually. It was 2012. He put that forward in 1953, I believe. So yeah, about 60 years. And that was when the first brain imaging research at Imperial College with people under the influence of psilocybin, they found, much to their surprise, that there was no increase in brain activity, okay, under the influence of psilocybin and LSD and DMT. There's no increase in brain activity in the normal state. In fact, there's a decrease in activity in brain. There's a decrease in brain activity. Now, nobody expected to find that, but it's, of course, that's exactly what Huxley was saying. Is like the brain's job is to constrain your experience, to constrain your consciousness, and in fact, psychedelics work by taking off that constraint and giving you this hyperconnectivity on every level, right? So in many ways, Huxley was prescient and absolutely second guessed what was going on, you know, functionally and also quite actually in the brain in some respects. It's more complex than that, but in essence, he was right.
I remember Peterson said about Jordan Peterson that these substances, if I'm correct, they inhibit the disruption of perception by memory or something like that. That was
right. In some respects, yes.
Yeah, that's kind of the filter.
Yeah.
The filter.
Yeah. I mean, they allow for this top down of memory to kind of come into perception as well, but they also kind of take the shackles off perception too. You know, we see different stuff. You know, we see a lot more stuff than we ordinarily do as well. So it's not just about memory and perception, but perception alone. But great, and that's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, I like that as well. Yeah. Well, thank you, David. It was just a great pleasure to talk with you, and that's an excellent start for our fourth season. That's like a perfect interview. And as I said, we'll publish it on the paper comes out on the 19th of August, if I'm not mistaken. So it's plenty of time there, and after that we'll make the video available in English.
Great.
And please send us your photo that you approve of.
Sure. I'll send some photos. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much. I mean, congratulations. I think you're doing a wonderful job here, and I'm really delighted what we're doing. And I very much enjoyed the interview. Thank you so much. And,